I'll look forward, incidentally, to comparing notes with everyone later on when they get a chance. I'm only one opinion of many, and you'll be hearing personal opinions from me on matters of public interest. But let me begin with something about which I'm somewhat resistant. I'm a bit shocked. I feel a certain consternation, in fact, having heard Dr. Parsons and before that Tom Popick say extremely unflattering things, I thought, about lawyers, that beloved group. We hear about litigiousness and so on, and really I think it leads us to forget the tremendous contributions made by lawyers in the field. I mean, they're such a giving group of people, and of course they only become involved in legal cases when it is absolutely necessary and unavoidable. And in order to cite evidence of this in the national security realm, and this will emerge as being more and more relevant to what I'm going to observe, there was an individual who became involved in several lawsuits a few years ago, ultimately suing, I believe, the Central Intelligence Agency, President Clinton, and the Honorable Anne McClellan. She was then the Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada. His name was René Joly, but let me leave it to the judge in one line to summarize his desperate situation and the valuable assistance afforded him by counsel. As I understand them, said the judge, the nature of his complaints against the numerous defendants, who include a number of doctors, medical facilities, and government agencies, is that they have conspired with the American government in its attempts to eliminate him and have otherwise taken various steps to interfere with his ability to establish himself and live freely as a Martian. Now, ultimately, I gather Mr. Joly had uneven success in the courts, but it did occur to me that now and then when we look at significant and sensitive issues, it can be useful to take the perspective of someone somewhat removed, perhaps from our country, maybe even from the planet. And so I cannot help but reflect how a Martian of Mr. Joly's disposition might regard some of the approach we find in Canada to certain of the national security issues we're talking about today and at this instant. I can't help but think that Martians and maybe any number of other creatures would be a bit troubled by some of our tendencies. And one I have focused on recently has been the question of immigration and immigrant communities. I asked the other day in a technical session how many people in the audience knew how many people we brought into the country each year in the immigration stream. And the result, I think, for many people was quite shocking. Only 2 of scores of people were confident that they had the answer to that question. The answer was about 300,000 people each and every year in the immigration stream, not counting an additional 200,000 to 250,000 people as temporary visa holders. And these would include students and certain categories of worker. The challenge is that we have at most only a few thousand people in a position in government to screen. And even at that, of course, one is entitled to ask what the definition and meaning of screening might amount to if many of the people coming in are coming from jurisdictions that are not in any way amenable to our looking behind their scenes to understand what the actual credentials and risks presented by some people might be. So you can imagine how valuable it might be for a security officer in Canada to call Tehran to get an opinion on somebody coming from Iran to Canada. That's no small issue, considering that in the last decade we have brought about 71,000 Iranians into Canada. And many Canadian Iranians protest that about half of those people, according to some of the Canadian Iranians I've spoken to, who've come into Canada since 1995, may be fundamentally loyal to the Tehran government, which, as you will remember, is, of course, one of the leading causes of terrorism in our world and involved, too, in nuclear developments of a disturbing sort. Similarly, we have China. Every year we bring in very roughly 30,000 people from China. And I'm among those who's inclined to believe that the vast majority of these individuals are absolutely dedicated to the well-being of Canada. But that hope, and expectation, even if it be accurate, does not deal realistically with what we find in the interplay of China and other smaller liberal democracies. Namely, that if among these huge numbers of individuals, and in per capita terms these are gigantic numbers of people, you were to find those who have family and or business interests remaining behind, then you can be assured that the home government has at least the potential of profound leverage to exercise upon those people. You can take Russia as well, which has not exactly distinguished itself under current management when it comes to human rights. But above all, we know for a fact that its GRU military intelligence service has been aggressive, without break, after the end of the Cold War, in attempting to penetrate a variety of our own interests, from, yes, military intelligence to political intelligence, commercial intelligence, and on it goes, compromising some of our most profound interests, indeed, one would say, perhaps, our sovereignty. So there you also have a possible problem of potential leverage that foreign, somewhat hostile government could exercise over otherwise well-meaning expatriates in Canada to the disadvantage of this country. One can go through a continuing list of these things, and it is extremely troubling to imagine what the results can be. And what happens, too, when, as a result of these large numbers, one finds demographics forming of potentially similarly inclined people with comparable vulnerabilities. Maybe the issue is, instead of vulnerability to a home government, a radical or extremist ideology. The prevalent one in the news, of course, is Islamic extremism. And we've had successive warnings from our many genuinely moderate Muslim friends who have been challenging some of the intake we've seen. And so, for example, Mrs. Rahil Raza, who is president of the respected Muslims Facing Tomorrow organization, and by way of disclosure, I'm a non-Muslim who sits on the advisory board of that organization. She has called for an outright moratorium on immigration from her Pakistani homeland because she is concerned about the national security ramifications and public safety ones for her fellow Canadians and self. We've seen a similar demand on the part of that other well-known moderate, Mr. Tariq Fatah, who has asked for such a moratorium. And the list goes on. This is a shared concern of all of us Canadians. It also does get us into the issue of what is generally called infiltration. What happens when you bring people in with vulnerabilities of various kinds to this country, whether ideological or otherwise, and they begin themselves to form of a kind of necessity polities within the country? Well, there are issues of social cohesion, potential division, maybe violence, but also what used to be called subversion in some ways. You may begin, if you find people in significant enough concentrations in specific enough areas, to find that they exercise political power. And there always and inevitably seems to be a politician or aspiring politician who's able to sniff out the trends and what might sell to individuals in such a situation. So before you know it, you might find that in your legislatures, your city councils, and your federal parliament, you have individuals whom you would not particularly want to invite over for supper on Sundays. Some say that, I guess, about politicians in general, but this I refer to as a national security type issue. When you look at that kind of problem, you can see the potential. You have issues of sovereignty that then come into the balance. Do you own your own country in a meaningful sense? Do you, as average Canadians of whatever background, religion, color, or anything else, really see the sort of integrity in your governing institutions that you would want? These are serious questions. And all of this at a time when we do look around the world and see a variety of evidences of infiltration. I made up a quick list just from a brief series of things available in the news. We've seen the State Department, it seems, penetrated by a contract employee, one of twin brothers sentenced for conspiracy. One of them gained access, it seems, to the means of influencing who might get passports. Well, you might want to just contemplate that if you're thinking about the incredible value of travel documents for the purposes of any number of national security opportunities and missions, whether foreign government penetration or terrorist movement. There was an individual, and two indeed, that I've come across lately who have been translators in the Syria-Iraq theater of operations for U.S. forces. These people are either facing or have been convicted on charges that they may be associated with IS. An individual with the Illinois Army National Guard, similar kind of focus. We saw somebody join the U.S. Army Explorers in order to get tactical and other training, weapons training, in order to use those skills ultimately when they might be destined for the Syria-Iraq theater. A congressional committee was told not too long ago that 100 suspected Islamic extremists were being tracked within the U.S. military itself. Well, not by any means all of these people were immigrants. Any number of immigrants have been challenging precisely this kind of situation, but again, it is just something worth bearing in mind. In France, there's a Navy signalman who's been a subject of national security interest in Germany. 20 former German soldiers are said to now be in the ranks of IS. We saw the Nadal Hassan killings in 2009 at Fort Hood in Tunisia. 110 police, National Guard, Army, and border people were detained, or at least were fired from their jobs owing to concerns about whether they had gone over to the other side. All of these are real concerns, and if you then look at some of these issues in cyber terms, and recall that whenever people, whether they're born and bred here or whether they come in from abroad, find themselves here as citizens, they have the same rights as anybody else to seek employment in what could be extremely sensitive government or commercial realms, and that could include in IT and other such things. And if you think about the possibilities then that might open, if we think we have a big problem, as we do, with cyber conventionally understood, just imagine that further complexity that those working within relevant areas might be working for the wrong side, whether to sabotage, to provide information, to facilitate openings to those who might be overseas and wanting to undermine us. And at this point, I'm reminded then of a tension, a stress that we all face, because the inevitable question is, well, how can we try to screen people at the level of, for example, employment? How can we maintain the integrity of systems from that end? It's going to be extremely difficult, and it rubs up against all kinds of constitutional and other rights, human rights, and so on. And we were fortunate yesterday at a technical session to have had a presentation by a representative, a distinguished lawyer with the Privacy Commissioner's office. And she pointed out some of the concerns and misgivings that she very articulately conveyed to us relating to the screening imperative, as at least some of us would be inclined to see it. She was describing some of the concerns about national security legislation that the government has come up with. And although I might not, for example, agree with what she may have had to have said on Bill C-51, she made valuable points that we should all be thinking about regarding the extent to which some form of review might be appropriate as we put together screening systems or try to update them to take into account the increasing threats that we face. So all of these things taken together suggest the melange and complexities with which we must conjure in this day and age. And I would very much invite you to encourage that kind of discussion, because a very great deal, our safety and maybe our survival, when you consider things such as EMP, can rely on this. Thank you very much for your consideration.